Superman the Animated Series first hit our television screens 25 years ago, following up the conclusion almost exactly 1 year prior of its predecessor, the award-winning Batman the Animated Series. This Superman became the foundation for the visual design scheme of the entire DC animated universe that followed, from a Batman of the future to an unlimited Justice League. But as much as we immediately recognize this iconic art style today, this Superman wasn't always the one we were meant to see. In the mid-90s, Superman was everywhere. In the comic books, he had just died horrifically in one of the medium's most worldwide famous stories, but very quickly come back from the dead as a mullet-flaunting Fabio. The most recent animated outing of the character, 1988's Ruby Spears-produced Superman cartoon, had just completed its 13-episode run. The late 80s Superman 4 and Supergirl movies had given way to a Superboy TV series, followed by Dean Cain's portrayal in the Emmy-nominated Lois and Clark. Superman's role in pop culture was, let's say, a bit oversaturated. All of this left the fine folks at Warner Brothers Animation with kind of an awkward assignment. How do you make a Superman animated series that encompasses the Man of Steel's world in a satisfying and meaningful way, while also standing apart from everything else super going on around it? This is the story of how Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, Dan Riba, Alan Burnett, and the rest finally landed on the DCAU aesthetic we know and love. From developing a near duplicate of the old 1940s Superman shorts to almost turning the whole show into a prototype Justice League, and every artistic decision in between. It's Star Trek, Hercules, and the king of Marvel Comics. This is how Superman the Animated Series found its face. Quite literally.
Showtime, everybody!
Engagement.
They can talk all they like.
That means everything.
Don't forget that.
You heard it, folks!
Everybody knows that Superman, strange visitor from a faraway planet, can change the course of mighty rivers and bend steel in his bare hands. But the big question is, will he ever have a successful cartoon series? 3 years after the original debut of Superman in 1938's Action Comics #1, Paramount Pictures approached animation company Fleischer Studios, known at the time for their work on Betty Boop, Popeye, and others, to produce a series of Superman cartoons. As the story goes, the Fleischer brothers didn't want to overwork themselves and thus submitted a budget they deemed ridiculous of $100,000 per episode, which Paramount cut in half to $50,000 a show, pushing $1 million by today's inflation standards, and greenlit it to the Fleischers' dismay. Their highest budget on a project ever, and they didn't even want to do it. But despite the headache, the Fleischers' Superman persevered, developing or evolving animation techniques that make it considered today to be one of the most high-quality productions in the golden age of animation. And while Superman and his world continued to appear in animated adventures for decades to come, through 1966's The New Adventures of Superman, Super Friends and its many spin-offs through the 70s and 80s, and of course, 88's Superman cartoon by Ruby Spears, the work the Fleischers and their follow-up Famous Studios had done through just 17 10-minute shorts back in the 40s continued to stand the test of time as the gold standard for superhero animation, one of the highlights of the genre's potential even today. It then comes as no surprise, really, that when the 90s Batman team were told, okay, now it's your turn, they sort of panicked. But this should be easy, right? Superman had technically been a part of the Batman the Animated Series world already, through appearances in 1993's Superman and Batman magazine, which presumed the animated world's handling of various DC Comics characters years before their inclusion in any proper DCAU production, as well as BTAS's tie-in comic book, The Batman Adventures, and a couple of children's golden books, all while rocking his, at the time, signature luscious locks of super hair. Is it also coincidence he fought a robot in almost every one of these appearances? I mean, there were just a lot of robots in the 90s. I guess. I don't know. But all of these had one major thing in common. They weren't reinterpreting the character for new eyes. They were simply looking to the mainstream comics of the time and doing whatever they were doing. They weren't so much an attempt to expand Batman the Animated Series into a full-fledged new DC Comics universe as it would eventually become, but more a simple capitalization on the popularity of the Batman show, because why not? The other heroes were just what readers already expected them to be, and nothing more. So when it did come time to produce an official Superman set in the BTAS continuity, the continuity of a show writer Bob Goodman described as an Emmy factory, Bruce Timm's team not only faced the challenges of living up to the audience's expectations after Batman, but the audience's and their own expectations for Superman himself. The inception of a Superman cartoon came as sort of a surprise to Bruce Timm and his team, who were, strangely enough, actually neck-deep in work on Freakazoid at the time, part of the Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain lineup of Steven Spielberg-produced Warner Brothers toons. But the timing couldn't have been better, as Timm was already beginning to become, as he put it, disenchanted with Freakazoid, a show he had originally conceived to be more action-heavy with a comedy flavor, but in actuality had become much more of a comedy variety show with occasional action-adventure sprinkles on top.
Round the moons of Snibia, I chuckle at thee. Beyond the Corpian clouds, I chuckle more at thee. Revenge is a dish best served with pinto beans and muffins. Kirk, old friend, Oh, sorry.
I'd already pretty much pulled out a Freakazoid and I was sitting around my office. Well, I'm getting a paycheck, but I'm not doing anything, and that can't continue for too long before someone notices. There was interest in doing an animated Superman because there was a lot of talk about doing a movie. I think that's what started the ball rolling. So, casually, president of Warner Brothers Animation, Gene McCurdy, mentioned to me one day,
"Do you want to do a Superman cartoon?"
And I went, "Yes, let's do it."
Famously, the canceled Superman Lives feature film starring Nicolas Cage as the Man of Steel had been in and out of development hell throughout the 90s. Producer John Peters had been desperately trying to get something off the ground before finally roping in writer Kevin Smith and director Tim Burton. Ultimately, and very long story short, this project still never managed to leap any sized building, but mutterings of a potential big-budget Superman movie was enough to reinvigorate WB's interest in the character in a similar manner to how Burton's Batman films had pushed BTAS into existence. And while the Batman show, being hot on the heels of those critically and commercially successful blockbuster movies, had allowed an unheard of $500,000 budget per episode, the Superman series wasn't quite as lucky. According to some of the crew, STAS's initial budget ran around $350,000 a show, a drastic cutback even compared to the 1940s cartoons. But regardless of cash flow, the team was determined to make their Superman stand out. But how?
These characters have been around so long in the various media, and we're trying to reinvent them to a degree, to make them seem interesting again, fresh and exciting. Me and some of the other creative people on the show would kind of, spitball ideas. From the minute Gene McCurdy first said to me,
"Batman cartoon,"
I knew kind of instantly what I wanted to do. Whereas with Superman, as much as I liked the character, I didn't really know exactly what I was going to do with him to make an animated series out of him.
It's TV, boys. Just a trumped-up story to boost ratings.
While the crew went to work on figuring it all out, on the other side of the curtain, in January of 1996, we the fans were treated to an article in Comic Scene magazine that announced a new Superman cartoon was well underway. Warner Brothers Animation has announced plans for an animated Superman series for September 1996 to air on the WB network. Bruce W. Timm, producer, designer, director of Batman the Animated Series, states that,
"I have done a bunch of designs for Superman and would love to do it.
As for the Man of Steel's appearance, Timm feels
it would be Fleischer all the way. Not just the Fleischer look, but the early Superman with his Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster look. I love that look on Superman with the little squinty eyes and everything. That would be my take on it."
But that's not what happened. This magazine article came out a mere 8 months before S-TAS premiered, and they still weren't publicly confident enough on the direction to take the look of things.
We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the character design is, learn the lessons of Batman the Animated Series, and apply them to this new show. We couldn't quite agree on a general approach to the show as to what would be the correct way to do a modern Superman. At one point, visually, we were still thinking in terms of the retro thing, like we had done with Batman, but we wanted to give it a slightly different feel, so it wasn't exactly what we had done before. Personally, I would take a similar approach to what we did with Batman and set it in a very 40s film noir-ish world.
Bruce Timm had it very set in his head that he wanted to go with this 40s style look, the design of the original comics, with several preliminary sketches of his in this style popping up in various places over the years. Everything from action poses to head studies to full body model sheets. And although the comics scene article goes on to describe the crew's wants and needs for the show matching what inevitably did wind up happening, such as casting name actors and bringing in recognizable, colorful supervillains like Mr. Mxyzptlk, Bizarro, and Darkseid, while they knew what they wanted the show to say, they wanted it to look like this.
A lot of back and forth, a lot of different stylistic things we tried. I got really stuck early on. I went back and looked at the original comics, and I fell in love with the Joe Shuster style. So I did spend some time actually trying to bring the Shuster kind of stylistics to our animation style. I did a drawing of Lois Lane where she looked like she was literally wearing 1940s clothing. The Daily Planet gang will definitely be there. Jimmy Olsen and Perry White, everybody. It will be very much a 40s kind of Jimmy Olsen rather than the new hip Jimmy Olsen. I want to do something different.
While being almost a carbon copy of the Fleischer cartoons that preceded it, this approach to Superman the Animated Series is still an extremely interesting bit of DCAU production history, but perhaps even more so due to how this style would have wound up affecting Superman's enemies. First, we have Lex Luthor, an obvious inclusion and perhaps the easiest to bring into the Shuster aesthetic. His appearance here is not terribly different from what we wound up actually getting, but you know that whole DCAU Lex Luthor is based on Telly Savalas Blofeld from On Her Majesty's Secret Service thing? You can't tell me that's not just literally Telly Savalas' face. How early on was the On Her Majesty's Secret Service influence on the Lex Luthor design a thing? Because even that Fleischer-looking Luthor looks like
always.
it. Yeah,
Bruce always thought that Lex should have been played by Telly Savalas. He had come up with a really cool look for him for that Fleischery world. Yeah. It has a little bit of the Lyle Talbot kind of feel to it.
But while Lex may have been an easy translation, most of the rest of Superman's villains would need to be radically reinterpreted in order to fit into this 1940s noir visual world.
Batman was easier because he had such a great rogues gallery. Almost all of the villains were really interesting and exciting because they were also psychologically screwed up and so weird and inventive. The list of Superman villains was staggeringly dull. There's the Parasite, Brainiac, and Bizarro, and that's it. All the other classic Superman villains are old fat guys in business suits. Where's the visual appeal there?
Initially, General Zod and his Lieutenant Ursa were set to appear on the show as part of this design scheme, before ultimately winding up on the DCAU's long list of, you don't have the rights to use this character, so you gotta compromise, and we got Jaxer and Mala instead. Zod's noir design bears a decent resemblance to a certain cape-clad immortal from Batman's world, though obviously inspired by the Terrence Stamp version of the character from the 1978 Superman film. And then there was Brainiac.
Initially, I did design the main cast. Brainiac was like the one villain that was even more period than BTAS.
For this design, Timm actually turned to the original 1966 Star Trek series, specifically the android Ruck from the episode What Are Little Girls Made Of?
That kind of 40s style would dictate the entire series to me, even when using the more science fiction-y characters like Brainiac. It would be really neat to do Brainiac as a 40s android from hell.
But although Timm's development of all these designs carried on as the game plan, while the rest of the crew stuck to figuring out the best Superman stories to tell, eventually it became obvious they weren't going to be able to out-Fleischer the Fleischers, or even outdo themselves on what Batman had gotten so right.
It looked great, but we thought, well, that's not enough of a visual break from Batman's world.
I don't want anyone thinking you're like that nut in Gotham City.
The problem was, that Schuster style was also what the Fleischers had used for their big inspiration. That's where the bar is set when you're doing animated Superman. Fleischer Superman. That's the level you're never gonna hit. I knew early on that we weren't gonna be able to use that as our goal, so whatever we came up with had to be unique on its own.
While Bruce had been the biggest proponent of the noir aesthetic, it just wasn't going to cut it for their own personal desires or those of Warner Brothers.
In this case, it was one of those things where they really said, for this reason, and this reason, we'd rather not just continue with the dark deco. Batman made a huge splash, and it's great, and sort of timeless, old-timey feel to it. That's great. It works fantastic for Batman. We want a Superman that feels more contemporary. And that was initially disappointing. I have to say, I don't know how disappointed Bruce was. In fact, I think he probably felt relief immediately. Oh my gosh, what am I setting myself up for? I think he was like, oh, great. Actually, okay, fine. I, on the other hand, saw these awesome drawings that Bruce had done, and I felt like, I was a little more heartbroken. You know, those Fleischers had meant so much to me, and the idea of like continuing that feel would have been just so wonderful.
Even though the Fleischer Superman cartoons had been a huge influence on the look of their Batman show, ironically, the team on Superman the Animated Series couldn't look back to Superman for inspiration.
We're like, great. Hey, guess what? Now we're doing Superman. And we just do, no.
Yeah.
No.
Are you crazy?
What? But you wanted this then? It totally makes sense. It has its own identity, and you want it always to have its own identity in every era. We wouldn't have progressed, I think.
So that was that. No more 40s Superman or Lois or Lex or creepy android from hell Brainiac, as cool as that looks, oh my god. Though it was for the best, frustratingly enough, they were back to square one, and with only a matter of months to figure this thing out. So rather than go all the way back to the literal drawing board, Timm and company thought, well, what about something completely different?
When the plug was pulled on the direction for the Fleischer approach, we were like, how do you do this fresh? Well, Bruce's first instinct was just let's not do another Superman series. We've all seen it a million times. Let's just do the Justice League.
Only one hero can track down Cave Guard. Only one hero has the heart to fight this fiend. That hero is on another network.
Even though almost the exact same creative team was jumping from Batman the Animated Series to Superman, the rights to Batman were tied up at Fox, as that show had been airing on the Fox Kids programming block. So to ever try and pair the two heroes together in a team-up proved, at the moment, impossible.
At a certain point, we toyed around with the idea of opening it up and having the show, instead of being just about Superman, kind of a prototype Justice League show, where it would be Superman and a rotating supporting cast of other superheroes. Oh, dang, I would watch that, yeah.
So yes, 6 years before the Justice League cartoon would even be a twinkle in Bruce Timm's eye, Plan B for Superman became, screw trying to do a unique take on Superman alone, let's just do the full-on Justice League right now. Bruce went all out with this idea, designing more than a dozen DC characters in the animated style, many of which we would eventually see in Justice League Unlimited years later. Everyone from Green Arrow and Black Canary, to The Question, Hawkman and Hawkgirl, Supergirl, Dr. Fate, Vixen, Light Ray, Orion, and even Black Lightning and Nightshade, as well as predictable classics like Aquaman, The Flash, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern planned to be Jon Stewart even this early on. Notably missing was, of course, Batman, but hey, as Bruce put it,
he already had his own show.
We were toying with the idea of introducing all the characters that would be in the JLA one by one in Superman. Then the last episode ever would be the formation of the JLA.
We'll rotate other heroes, and we'll get a small group of characters, and it'll be a sort of streamlined Justice League. That's how we'll do it. Right off the bat. Warner's, DC, everyone's like, no.
I'm sorry, I just hallucinated. What?
Plan A, in the toilet. Plan B, super toilet.
So much clogging!
According to Bruce, it was Jeanette Kahn, then president of DC Comics, who made the call to put an end to this version of the Superman show's development.
She met with us and said,
You know, I just don't think you guys should do this. You should give Superman the respect that he deserves and give him his own show, the way you did Batman before you get into the Justice League.
Right away, we said, yeah, you're right.
And so, time to start over again. A blank slate once more. Somehow insert a tabula rasa joke. Members of the crew began tossing out ideas just to see what would stick. Writer Paul Dini even loved the idea of including Superman's dog Krypto, having grown up collecting comics with Krypto on the cover. But when he pitched it to Bruce, much like the reaction given when BTAS story editor Sean Catherine Derrick had wanted Batman to have a dog, he simply got back,
No Krypto.
And design work was even changing all the way up until the finish line for the series, as Daily Planet editor-in-chief Perry White was originally planned to be African American, as seen in these model sheets dated less than a year before the show's debut and even marked final.
And that was shut down because they just kind of wanted a little bit more continuity between the animation. And it wasn't like we're literally doing Lois and Clark, whatever, but there's just the optics of like, oh, the guy on the TV show doesn't look like the guy in the animated series or the guy in the comics. And so they wanted to kind of have a world that sort of felt a little bit more unified.
And then Lawrence Fishburne plays him in Man of Steel.
Yeah. So we got our wish.
Dan Riba even went into storyboards for the first STAS episode, The Last Son of Krypton, with this version of Perry intact, later having to cover up and redo the designs on post-its over top.
The consolation that we got, and it worked great, and I wish we had more episodes, but Inspector Henderson then became
okay.
For a visual, he was Morgan Freeman. 7 had come out, and we were like, okay, he looks great in a trench coat, and he's this great image as a cop. Life has beaten him down. It's perfect for Inspector Henderson. It's a great take on it.
Well, that's a cool little extra tidbit that I didn't know.
What? You don't remember the Morgan Freeman?
No, I don't think I knew that.
Oh, well, don't tell him, just in case.
Yeah, okay, next time I interview Morgan Freeman, I won't tell him about it. As the weeks and months passed, against all odds, the show was beginning to come together visually. While Batman's world was dark and grimy, even to the extent of literally airbrushing the backgrounds onto black paper, Superman's was, in Timm's words,
bright and optimistic. We're saying the show is set in the present, but it's a very futuristic present.
Being set in the same world as BTAS, it made sense to continue a similar Art Deco aesthetic, but not push it quite as far as the Fleischers did. The creatives referred to this interpretation as Ocean Liner Deco, in line with the stylized rounded edges of Ocean Liner posters from the 20s and 30s. And while this helped tremendously with the look of the city, the cars, the machinery, they were still stuck on how to design the people.
What's something new that we can do with this show? It's all been done.
And then it hit them. Back in the 1970s, prolific Marvel Comics artist and writer Jack the King Kirby had ported over to DC to create the Fourth World mythos of the New Gods, the likes of Darkseid and his cronies on the planet Apocalypse, and their opposing good guy counterparts from New Genesis. And now, in the 90s, the most hardcore, spike and pouch-filled superhero equivalent of a heavy metal rock band riding skateboards era in comic book history, Darkseid and co. fit right in as the high-profile supervillains moments that were defining DC Comics stories, such as a 1995 arc showcasing Darkseid's involvement with the cyborg Superman, or 1997's 4-issue Genesis crossover event. And so, the S-TAS crew turned to Jack Kirby's art, which had been a huge influence on Bruce Timm's own style for decades, as inspiration for the show.
One of the greatest assets we had was in the tremendous creations of Jack Kirby. He was the defining creator of superheroes throughout most of the 20th century.
That was another mix in the brew, and things started gelling at that point. He did have a very specific design approach to science fiction type stuff, so we thought that would be kind of a neat way of spicing up the show, would be to bring in Darkseid and the Fourth World characters. Once we brought Darkseid on screen as one of our main bad guys for the series, then of course all of the Kirby stuff just went off the charts.
We were noticing things that were more angular and animating better that way. Bruce was just like, okay, let's just do this intentionally.
Thank God for Darkseid.
And yet, for whatever artist's block reason, finalizing the design for Superman himself still continued to prove to be next to impossible to get right.
I did zillions and zillions of drawings of Superman. I just couldn't quite nail him down in the powerful, iconic image like we had done with Batman.
Do they keep the mullet? Do they axe the mullet? Superman did have the mullet in those older BTAS era appearances on the printed page, but was it the right move for the screen? In Wizard magazine, Bruce Timm cited long drawn-out negotiations with DC Comics over this subject.
Yes, they did want to have us do it, and it came down to the heads of Warner Brothers were like, no, that's not a character.
As cool as it may or may not have eventually looked on Nightwing, a neck warmer on the Man of Steel just didn't look right in motion. It didn't belong on this Superman.
At the end of the day, these aren't our characters. DC calls all the shots, so they could do whatever they wanted, and we had no input whatsoever. But when it came to animation, it just wouldn't work. The mullet wasn't really going to be an easy thing to animate or look particularly good on the character.
The world didn't really need a Superman, just a brave one.
Possibly the strangest piece of all of this, it would actually be an old Hercules cartoon from the 60s that would finally wrap up the look of Superman the Animated Series with a nice little bow.
Strangely enough, Dan Riba brought in some cheap bargain tape he had bought of the old Hercules show from the 60s. We were watching it just for fun, and I went, wow.
Well, wait, how about I just have Dan himself tell you the story, because holy crap, come on, look at those side by side. That's insane. It's the exact same thing.
For people who think we just ripped it off, and I really want to make this very clear. First off, I have to say that there's an aspect of Bruce that I hate. Oh, I'm frozen. Oh, no.
You're back.
The internet wouldn't allow me to say that.
Yeah.
He's like a freak of nature, and he'll remember any drawing or any comic book, any inker, any, whatever. He'll just, this is all in his, all these poses, all this comic panels are in his head.
I just know too much about all this stuff. So.
Yeah. Yes, you guys do. Way too much. So when he was designing Superman, there was no let me copy it was it was in his head. He was drawing this thing, and he was actually having trouble with the turn. He asks me into his room, can you help me with this? Which is a very rare thing.
Right.
And I look at the design, and it hits me what it reminds me of. Wow, you remember that Hercules cartoon from the 60s? And you're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, that's kind of what he looks like. I'm like, I have a tape, I'll bring it in. And we're like, oh my gosh, it doesn't just look a little like him. It looks a lot like him. But it was really helpful because he was like, oh my gosh, there's the turn. That's the profile that I needed to help. But Bruce had already figured out the shape and the design of the character before in 3/4 and from the front. It was more about the side view, the profile. It was more about how to make this.
Okay.
But seriously, Bruce had the gist of all of that down before we even looked at it. So, believe me, I was there. It was an influence to help finesse it as opposed to an inspiration, at least consciously. He did not rip it off consciously. And it was really like one of these things to just help seal the deal and kind of help with returns and stuff. But what's funny about the Hercules cartoon is that it was New York animators. And some of these guys may have actually worked on famous studios in the Fleischer stuff.
Oh, okay.
And there is a sense of maybe that's what a Superman cartoon would have looked like had famous studios gone on and Paramount continued doing Superman cartoons all the way from the 50s to the 60s.
Huh.
What is that? Can anyone tell me?
Looks like a flying guy.
No kidding.
So, with everything locked into place, on September 6th, 1996, the crew finally delivered us Superman the Animated Series.
Tonight on the WB, Michigan J. Frog invites you to join in the world premiere of Superman.
He was the only child of a doomed, distant planet. Goodbye. Brought to Earth to fulfill his destiny as a crusader for truth and justice.
No way.
Superman.
The show was a massive success for the WB network, paying tribute to all different eras of Superman that had existed up until then, and paving the way for far more interlocking continuity stories for the future of the DCAU than Batman had ever allowed room for. The creative team had done the impossible, envisioned and executed a brand new take on the character that felt true to Superman's history while also being instantly recognizable as its own unique thing. And although the show didn't wind up looking like a Fleischer clone after all, it still retained many of its qualities.
If you look at the color palette of our Superman, the deep blue of his suit and the crimson red of his cape, those were inspired directly by the Fleischer look, as opposed to the more primary colors people expected from a cartoon Superman at the time. The stories we told were inspired by the Fleischers too. Notice that right out of the gate we pitted Superman against a giant robot, and found our way to get him fighting a dinosaur early on too. I have very fond memories of Hilary Bader and me locking ourselves in her office and watching the entire series of Fleischer's Superman, as required homework for the show. We'd both seen some of them before, but not all. We got a big kick at how Bud Collyer would usually stress the
"This looks like a job for Superman,"
as though while watching a volcano erupt and lava flow toward a town, he had to decide whether it was his place to help.
Well, well, an alien in my own backyard, and such a civic-minded one too.
S-TAS kept its word on many of its promises. The look of Metropolis, the main supporting cast and villains, the 80s John Byrne comics depiction of Superman's power set, but it also defied many of the early notions. Jimmy Olsen did wind up more modern and hip, and Superman did eventually wind up teaming up with the likes of The Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, Dr. Fate, and even Batman, whose rights had lapsed from Fox's lack of syndication of Batman the Animated Series, allowing the team to revamp the Dark Knight's world into the new Batman adventures. Yes, snooze you lose, Fox. And even though it took forever for Bruce Timm and his cohorts to nail down the look of the show, it ultimately became the blueprint for the character design decree of every DC Animated Universe series going forward. The new Batman, Batman Beyond, the latter seasons of Static Shock, and even the Zeta Project, undergoing slight tweaks for the Justice League shows, but still maintaining the sleek, angular, simplified style that defined Superman.
We had tweaked our in-house design theories on Superman a bit. Superman was a bit more angular than the original Batman show was, and I was pretty pleased with the results. In retrospect, I think we did a really good job with the Superman show. It was a little bit more of a struggle than the Batman show, but ultimately, I think it was a pretty darn good show.
You sound too good to be true.
I remember thinking about the decades of work that had been done before, and I can only imagine the thousands of writers in Superman up until that point, and the honor of getting to contribute to this body of work.
After that initial disappointment, like, oh well, you're like, hey, we got to make this guy.
Hey,
and
that's right there.
Yes, there he is. I love this guy.
Yeah.
I was like, this is a really iconic image. This is like its own thing. Now we've defined a new guy for a new generation, and that's always better.
Be brave, my son. Remember who you are and the legacy you carry inside you.
On Halloween Day, October 31st, 1996, the first issue of Superman Adventures hit shelves, effectively usurping all previous iterations of a DCAU Superman in tie-in media. And this same design from the show went on to be used in 1997's Adventures in the DC Universe comic series. This was the Superman of the DC animated universe. This mulletless Jack Kirby Hercules had become the defining Superman for a generation. Even if we did see the mullet slapped back on him for one of those kids' books in 2002, but just ignore that.
It works in theory.
And while I'm not disappointed at all with what we got, it's always interesting to look back at what could have been. Had the Fleischer version gotten the go-ahead, what might a Batman crossover have looked like? Would we ever see this Star Trek Brainiac do the fusion dance with much more Telly Savalas Lex Luthor? Would the Justice League version of the series have led to better or worse stories than what JLU gave us by the mid-2000s? We can only imagine. But as someone who's been doing his darndest to emulate this art style his entire life, I can tell you I certainly will continue to imagine.
Artists.
My God, that took a long time to edit. This was a really fun subject to cover, and I hope all of you found it just as interesting as I did and learned at least a couple new things. The deeper I dug into this, the more I uncovered that even I had never known before. That Brainiac design will haunt me for years, and that Hercules thing, that's ridiculous. Would you have preferred to see any of these earlier versions of the Superman show, or are you happiest with what we got? And if given the chance, how would you design a Superman cartoon? A huge thank you to Casually Comics, Godzilla Mendoza, V Infuso, Laron Reedus, and especially Scott from NerdSync for lending their voices for this video. I say especially for Scott because holy crap, there were a lot of Bruce Timm quotes. I didn't realize how many there were until I started emailing them to you. I'm so sorry. All of their channels are linked below. They're all really great artists, fantastic video creators. I highly recommend you check them out if you somehow haven't before. And thank you to director Dan Riba for once again hopping on a random Tuesday afternoon Zoom call with me to help fill in the blanks for this essay and providing some of the art that you saw on screen. You the real MVP, Dan. Don't let anyone tell you different. I don't know why they would. And of course, thank you so much to all of our wonderful Patreon supporters who make this video and every other video possible. If you'd like to help support us, head on over to Patreon at the link below. If you liked this video, I also did a deep dive a little while back on every single confirmed power and weakness of the DCAU Superman. And we have a whole playlist of Superman related videos all linked below or above my head on this, I think it's this side. You think we'd know by now. I loved talking about this, and I'd love to talk about more subjects like it, like how Justice League had almost a third of its image missing for the DVD release, or the infamous Bat embargo, or that weird Justice League marketing campaign that happened before the Justice League cartoon debuted that only existed in like coloring books and Happy Meal toys. So let me know if any of those sound interesting to you. Thank you for watching, and of course be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any other upcoming videos, comics, live streams, and whatever else from the Watchtower Database.
As the bare naked ladies would say, it's all been done. Oh, woohoo! It's all been done. Copyright claim.
All right.
I know you have a baby to get back
I do. Thank you, though.
I have people to say.
Yes, you do. Yeah, get out of here. Yeah, 1 second.
I need to. You need to add the smear though that I invented.
Yeah.
When I leave the screen, I'm so proud of my smear.